This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design development with a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 410, off the cuff number 7. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about this and that with our Talking Drupal hosts. I'm Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development, and today my co-hosts are, for the third week, Tim Plunkett, engineering manager at Acquia. Also joining us is Martin Anderson-Klutz, Senior Solutions Engineer at Acquia as well. And finally, we have John Picozzi, Solution Architect at EPAM.
Howdy.
Okay, now to talk about our module of the week, let's turn it over to Martin, Senior Solutions Engineer at Acquia and maintainer of a number of modules of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, Nick. Have you ever wanted to give content creators the power to preview how their posts will look on mobile devices even before publishing them? There's a module for that. It's called Responsive Theme Preview, and it was originally created in February of 2013. It has a 2.1.1 version, which works with Drupal 9 and 10, and an 8.x-1.1 version that works with Drupal 8 and 9. Now, it's officially marked as maintenance fixes only, but the last release was actually just in the past week. It has 21 issues open, but only 2 of those are bugs against the 2.x branch. Also has test coverage, and it's currently in use by over 8,200 websites. Now, it has a team of maintainers, but the last couple of releases were by Rajesh Shiputra, which is actually also a member of the Acquia team as well. Now, in terms of how the module works, it essentially adds a drop-down to the secondary toolbar that allows a content creator to select a device whose display resolution you want to preview for the current page. It launches in a modal overlay and can be rotated so that you can see the landscape view of that. Now, the list of devices can be configured to keep up with the most popular devices as they change over time, including things like phones and tablets. Also, if you are not using the admin toolbar, it does offer a block that you can use to provide access to the preview links as well. Now, it's obviously not a perfect representation of how a given page will look on a mobile device, but it can be a very useful way to see sort of a quick approximation of that page and how to look on different screen sizes. So let's talk about the responsive theme preview module.
So it sounds like it's best used by a desktop user, like it's giving you kind of an overlay to look at, which I assume wouldn't work great on a mobile device.
I mean, I suppose theoretically you could probably use it on a tablet to preview like smaller phones. But yeah, I think it's fair to say the intended use is really for desktop.
Yeah, I have a question about it. I know, for example, Chrome has its own native developer tools that do that. Are there any advantages to using this module over that you can think of?
I think probably just the fact that it's sort of there as part of the website Chrome. So something like the Chrome native tools and other browsers have their own sort of ways of potentially using those. Some of them through plugins. Definitely also useful, but I would say those tend to be used more for developers, and this is really meant to be because it's sort of explicitly there on the page, something that's simpler for content creators and editors.
Well, thank you, Martin, and glad to have you for the rest of the show. So let's move on to our primary topic. So as I mentioned at the top of the show, this is another off the cuff. So each of us have a couple of topics we wanted to bring up and talk a little bit about. And the first one is Module Builder. I'm not familiar with Module Builder. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about it? What is it?
Absolutely. So Module Builder is really intended to sort of simplify the process of setting up a custom module. So used to be Drupal console, and then later, Drush has had capabilities for scaffolding out certain parts of a module in terms of, creating, let's say, your info.yaml and module files, maybe building out some of the boilerplate for custom entities. A Module Builder, I think, is meant to be sort of more of a way to do that all at once in terms of really selecting the pieces that you want to create for your module. And the other benefit that it has is that if you're using it on a local project, it will also scan through your code base and sort of see all of the hooks available even ones that are created in your custom code, whereas Drush tends to only provide options for implementing, let's say, hooks that are in Drupal core as an example. So it can be pretty powerful in terms of working with a more custom code base as well.
That's cool. I know that I used to generate. I think Core provides some, or Drush might provide some sort of generator API, because when we were working on the ECA stuff, Jurgen used a generator that he had put together for a bunch of the different stuff. So like setting up an action, it will scaffold all that stuff out for you. So yeah, there's a lot of boilerplate in Drupal now. It's kind of a fact of life. So anything that can make that easier is wonderful, I think. I'll have to check it out.
Yeah, absolutely. There was actually, so I had heard about it years ago, looked at it briefly, but never really got using it. And then when I was at Drupal Dev Days, I guess it's now a couple of weeks ago, there was a presentation about it. So I'll put a link to the video of that in the show notes as well.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's been around like since Drupal 5 at least. I think it has, as you mentioned, all the other alternatives has kind of ebbed and flowed with how much it is the primary approach, and I think it's kind of, you know, the de facto one at this point. But yeah, it's been around for as long as I have, basically.
All right, Tim, we're excited to have you on the show, and as one of the maintainers of Drupal on sort of an ongoing basis, was curious if you can share with us anything you're excited about in the upcoming Drupal 10.2 release we should see later this year.
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing I'm excited about is all the improvements to the field UI. There's actually a couple things that snuck into 10.1. Drupal 10.1.0 came out about a month ago, a month and a half now, and some of our improvements were in there, and actually some people already noticed them. Nick, I think you noticed a couple.
Yep.
And then at Dev Days, apparently people were coming up to, members of the team that worked on it and complimenting on things that honestly I didn't even realize did get into 10.1. We've been working on it just with 10.2 as the target, but we got them done so quickly. I'd say we started with prototypes back in February for some of these improvements and went straight into user testing. We started with ideas, which led to user testing, which led to prototypes, which we went through that whole cycle, which is kind of uncommon for Drupal core development. Usually someone just drops a load of a bunch of code and says, here's a good idea and here's the code for it, and then we go from there, starting out with the sort of the solution. So we started with the problem definition and went sort of the more typical ideation process. And we have a team at Acquia who's working on it. There's some members of the community working on it, and I'm really excited for the things that we're finishing now that should be in for 10.2, mostly around field creation. So the content modeling experience will improve somewhat dramatically.
So I'm curious about the specifics. What are some of the specific things that are changing?
So, for example, right now, if you want to go create a new field, you go click the button that says create a new field, and it prompts you with a select list of every possible field type. And it can be really hard to kind of differentiate between all those things and understand what they might mean. And also, you might not even realize that it's a very long select list and there are many options. You have to scroll all the way to the bottom to find them all. And that's kind of overwhelming. Knowing whether or not, if you want a list of numbers, you can't just stop it where it says number. You have to go find the list section and find that. And when you're looking at that, you have to decide whether you want an integer or a decimal or a float. And good luck knowing whether or not you actually want a decimal or a float, because they're different, but in very subtle ways. The same thing, which goes back to my original, Drupal days, is what kind of date field do I actually want? Do I want a timestamp? Do I want it to be ISO 60, whatever it is? And so the new UI presents a bunch of cards that are the categories or kind of grouped together of the different fields. And then once you select one of those categories, like number or date, it gives you the options below that with a description of what they are and why you might want to use them. So it takes it from the most unfriendly select list in Drupal core to one of the most helpful, visually, delightful experiences in Drupal core. That's the first step. The second part is that there are about 3 screens you have to click through when you're adding a field to get to the end process. You have to know whether or not the settings are applied, if you want it to be required, if you want to have multiple values, if you want to have sort of like validation, like for numbers, like the minimum or maximum or default value. and those are spread over different forms, and it's not clear why they're on different forms. The other problem is as you click through each step, those changes are going live to your site. I mean, obviously, if you're on prod, that's a huge problem. But even if you're on staging, it can be confusing to have these new fields created. So the new flow will save all the changes or delay all the changes until the very last step and save them all at the same time. And we'll combine all those kind of confusingly separate forms into a single form as it was in the Drupal 7 days. So all those things are on target for Drupal 10.2.
I want to say it took me so long. I don't want to say how long it took me to realize that one of those forms were the things that were for this specific instance of the field.
Yes.
The other was for the base field.
Yes, the field storage itself that's shared across all bundles. Yep.
Although
that was not true in those concepts existed in Drupal 7, but they were not presented in a confusingly separate way until Drupal 8, which is when we just changed the forms to match to the way it's stored in code, like in config rather. And we don't need to show off how it's stored in config to the end user. They don't need to know those things.
I will say, once I finally realized that, I do like that, because it, like, you just know, like if you're editing something, if you're changing it, but it's a much better workflow to have them in one form.
Yeah, it'll still be very clear which ones are which.
Yeah.
I think the biggest example of why when it can be frustrating right now is if you want to change an entity reference, and this is obviously if you don't have any content in it, because you can't really change too much about things once they're started to be the fields are in use. Let's say you set up an entity reference to users, and then later you want to go change it to, or the other way, from nodes first, right? Then you want to change it to users or back and forth. Which bundles you select, so like I wanted to point to articles or recipes or whatever, is on one form, and the fact that it's pointing to nodes or comments or taxonomy terms is on a different form. And then how it's actually then selected by the user, whether it's just the list of them or it's using a view, that's in a different place. And all those things are going to be unified now.
You know what would be my favorite change if it was possible too, is if you could say something like, especially for entity reference forms, if you could say, hey, the bundles it points to are locked. They should be part of the base storage, right? Because a lot of times when you have an entity reference field, if you're reusing it, you want them to be the same everywhere. I mean, there's cases where you do want it to be the same field but different references. But most sites that I work on, if I'm reusing an entity reference field, I want it to point to the exact same bundles. And if you add a new bundle type, having to edit every single instance of that field, you have to remember, that it's everywhere, and
I think that's a modification that could be made. The other thing we did work on a lot is the reuse flow. Right, previously the reuse field was buried under the create a new field as a separate select list, which gave you no context of where those fields were used and how they were set up. And now when you click, there's a separate button at the top level now that will say reuse a field, and it'll give you a table of all the fields that are available, what bundles they're used on, the basic, high level settings. I think the thing that you had noticed that's in 10.1 right now is in the list of fields on a content type, if it's an entity reference or if it's other kinds of specific subfields like field types, will give you more metadata about how it's configured. It'll say not just any reference, but what it's pointing to.
Yeah. And
it gives you that information in that table. So I think that reuse experience is improved similarly.
That is the thing I noticed, and I have to say my favorite thing, and then I think we can move on to the next thing. But my favorite thing about that is it's one of those changes I never thought about. It was one of those things that annoyed me about Drupal core, but I never realized, and then it was just fixed. So like.
I wanted to say that's the power of doing the user interviews. We conducted, I mean, Lowry did a majority of them, but many people worked on the user interviews, both conducting them and then kind of collating the observations. But that was one thing that stuck out. It was like, yeah, this is annoying and this could be better. And it was the least invasive change I think we could have possibly made. And it was, it's going to be better for everyone who ever hits that page, but also for the longtime users, it is something that's good enough that you notice it. And feel appreciative of it. So the user interviews it's always painful to have to sit there and watch someone pick apart a UI that you've just, dealt with and learned your entire life. And it's like, well, that's how it is. That's just how it is, blah, blah, blah. But being able to make changes and improve those things is really, really kind of gratifying.
It's interesting to hear you talk about it, because I think a lot of times, like Drupal's come so far from its roots, and its roots were very like developer centric, and a lot of the UI UX patterns you see are very developer centric. And I think that this is probably a holdover from that, and now it's being it's being revamped in a way that's more quote unquote user friendly, right?
I will say, when we pitched that we wanted to work on this with internally at Acquia, I was pointing out, is the oldest untouched UI in Drupal core. It effectively hasn't changed since CCK, which is the first module I ever used. And yeah, it really needed that, and it needed us to uproot those sort of long held, just this is how we do things. I think the other biggest thing I wanted to point out was that I think the nice thing about doing user interviews that way are these are little things that no one would ever really file a bug report for. It's not a bug, it's just how it is. But the improvement, it benefits so many people. I think having the ability to say this is bad without having to come up with a solution yourself is really powerful. That can be, it usually doesn't really go that far in Drupal. If you drop a bug report and you don't have any good suggestions on how to fix it, it might not get the same amount of attention. So I think doing these user interviews has been a really powerful way to get these little things fixed.
I won't go into my tirade about non-code contribution and how it's very important, and how UX folks should look at the UX of Drupal and put in feature requests to improve it where they see issues. But maybe I just did go into my tirade and just an abridged version.
And that's what we're doing.
There you go.
It's been great.
I concur. I think it's all great. It's all great. And I look forward to 10.2 and 11 and 12 and the future. Speaking of the future, dun dun dun. Let's talk about AI, because it's everywhere now. I have clients actually asking me about better uses of AI and how they can use AI to kind of move faster, do things quicker, create websites faster. Martin, you actually, I think, dropped into the Talking Drupal chat something about Augmentor as an alternative to AI module for Drupal. Now, I think we're probably all familiar, or at least when you listen to this podcast, you will be familiar, because I'm about to tell you about the ChatGPT, I think, demo, or the OpenAI demo, I guess I should say, that was done at DrupalCon. Dries kind of showed a video of kind of the Open AI module working in Drupal, which was pretty impressive, I think. But you're saying that this is kind of a different version, or an alternate possibility to that module. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'd love to. So I came across this module on the weekend. I was just doing a little bit of research in terms of AI capabilities within Drupal, and came across this. It sounds like it's actually been developed over, I think, a few years now by some folks down in the Australian Drupal community, and that's maybe why here in North America we haven't heard about it quite as much. For anyone listening, and I'm sure we'll have a link in the show notes, but it's Augmentor, spelled Tor, which I wonder if it's maybe meant to be like a play on words of like mentor as opposed to just Augmentor. It feels like, my autocorrect goes off every time I put in Augmentor, but for anyone trying to find the module on Drupal.org, it's Tor. I think the primary difference between it and OpenAI is that it feels like it requires more work to set up, but it gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of how you do that. So as a simple example, both modules will allow you to do things like, say, if I've already got content in my body field, have it, suggest a title or suggest tags. And those are the kinds of things that I think actually AI today is quite good at. I think in terms of generating content on its own, it has some definite limitations. So it doesn't know about anything, or at least the ChatGPT models don't know about anything more recent than currently September of 2021. So in terms of saying like, tell me about single directory components, in Drupal, it's not going to know anything about those except for things that, go back that far. Whereas to be able to say, take human generated content and augment it in different ways, I think AI is actually really good at that. And we've seen sort of content architectures that expect to have sort of, a nicely written summary, and then nobody fills them out. So we end up sort of like truncating the main body field, and you can end up with like splits in the middle of paragraphs, or you have to use like smart trim to get, that truncated in a way that reads a little better. Whereas AI can actually write that summary for you. The augmenter module feels a little bit more, I guess I feel like there's more thought gone into the UX of some of those things. So as a simple example, you can say, have it generate 3 different suggestions for titles, and then I can, as a content creator, pick one of those. Or it'll generate a bunch of tags, but they're actually sort of links, and you click on the ones that you want, and it automatically adds those into your tag field. Whereas I feel like, at least the way they were the last time I used the OpenAI module, it's a little bit more manual in terms of how you would get sort of that machine generated result and actually get it into the Drupal field. The other key distinction is that I think in the OpenAI module, it sort of hard codes the way certain queries will be written. And so, if you are a person who wants to sort of really tweak exactly how the prompt is going to be generated to send to ChatGPT, using something like Augmenter really gives you a lot more control to sort of get the exact result you want. And I think also actually probably learn a little bit in terms of how those, AI prompts work as well. So, as I say, it's definitely more work to set up, but I feel like at the end of the day, you're probably better off for going through that process yourself.
So I have a follow-up question here, and this is more of just a general question for everybody, right? So when I was first talking about this, I had said that I was talking to a client the other day, and they were talking about how, AI could kind of make their lives easier. And, I kind of focus the conversation on content creation, right? To kind of facilitate speedier content creation, facilitate checking of content for, in internal terms and accuracy, that sort of thing. But one of the things that came up was AI for increasing development speed and being able to, write code, build websites in like an AI generated sort of way. And I'm wondering what the feeling is or the temperature is in the room to like, hey, like let's let AI write our code for us, and what types of oversights you think might be necessary there in order for that to be successful, or maybe you just think it's not successful.
I mean, I think with any tool, we have to learn what the limits are and what we need. But long term, I forget who said this, but somebody said something like, AI isn't going to replace programmers. AI isn't going to replace lawyers. AI isn't going to replace a lot of these skilled trades, at least not for a long time. But what it will do is it will allow the developers that use AI to replace the developers that don't, and lawyers that use AI to replace lawyers that don't, for example. So we don't really know what that looks like yet, but most likely what it is things like the module builder generator will become more intelligent, more capable, and get you further into scaffolding. It'll be able to predict certain things. Like one of the things that's really tedious as a developer is, let's say you have to create an array of a bunch of things, then you need to create a switch statement based on that stuff, right? You have to like manually change all the cases and do all this kind of stuff to it. But if an AI can see like, oh, you're following this pattern, just generate the rest of that switch statement for you. Yeah, you still need to populate stuff, but it's a tool. We have to learn. It's the same thing as like CI, CD. Like years and years ago, you used FTP to deploy. And then once these tools started coming out that allowed it, I'm sure there were DevOps people that are like, I'm only going to use FTP because then I can be sure I'm putting it in the right place. And you can't trust, Travis or whatever the first iteration of that was, right? And I think it's the same thing is going to happen with AI. We have to find out where it's helpful and where it's not helpful, and start integrating that stuff into our workflow. It also, Another thing that I think that will really dictate this is um, what pricing models and things come out. Like a lot of companies right now are doing research, and a lot of stuff is paid, but they're going to become paid services at some point, right? And how much is that going to be? What kind of access are people going to have? What are the tiers going to be? Like there's a lot of open questions still, I think, with how it's going to be integrated into people's workflows.
Yeah, I think that's kind of like the way I also am looking at it, I guess, is like it's another tool to help developers move faster, but I don't know that it's going to replace developers, right? And I think like there's a common misconception there that like an AI could replace a developer, right? And be able to move faster than a developer. But I feel uneasy with anybody that has that opinion because I don't feel like that's accurate, at least yet.
I think about sometimes there are fields where as technology advances as a society, we seem to lose an appreciation for technical specialists in different fields. So I think about people who used to do typesetting before desktop publishing came along, and a lot of the work and expertise that they have, I feel like some of it got filtered into more and more advanced desktop publishing software, but some of it probably there are rules that they would have considered very strict back whatever that would be, let's say 30 years ago, that nowadays people don't even notice when they pick up a magazine that those things aren't followed anymore. And there probably are things that as things get more automated, that as programmers potentially we might lose some of those as well. But at the end of the day, sometimes there's a level of kind of good enough, and if we can give people products that are cheaper, iterate faster in terms of providing better functionality, sometimes there's a trade-off there that people are happy to accept. But I agree that hopefully these kinds of tools, and particularly when you think about AI in the context of programming, that it's really more about being able to better leverage the resources that you have than thinking about how they can actually replace people.
Yeah, I think Nick's example is really like, it's really resonating with me, because it's like, hey, if I could say to an AI, or if a developer could say to an AI, hey, based on this list of values, build an array and then build a switch statement to do what you need to do with that array, like that, and then look at it and go, yeah, this is good, I can use this. That's far more powerful than like, hey, build a application that does all this stuff, right? And then maybe it works, maybe it doesn't.
Yeah, I think there's a what you just said, John, Taylor, dives into what I'm trying to think about, which is the abuse of it. How do we monitor it? How do we deal with it? And that's been a recent topic in Drupal core, or in Drupal issue queues in general. And the DA just published a draft policy for AI using contribution, and I'll link it in the show notes. But the premise is that when using AI in the course of making a contribution to Drupal, we require you to disclose that AI was used in crafting the code or content, carefully review and test the output to ensure it's relevant and that it works, and provide human intervention to correct inaccuracies, mistakes, or broken code. And it's saying if you're using bulk use of AI, it may or may not result in a ban, like permanent ban from Drupal.org, which is great because there's been a rash of ChatGPT or whatever AI generated contributions lately that are just bogging down module maintainers. Because they're useless. It's just complete waste of time.
Yeah, and we can move on after this, but that's been my point right along. Like, it's not that AI stuff is bad out of the gate, but all these big systems like Google, like they have to filter through it. Like the amount of content that AI can generate compared to humans is orders of magnitude higher, and these systems have to deal with it. And like you said, like even just that, if you remember, what was it, about a year ago, when people started getting credit for just posting a screenshot of the patch applying, like that bogged down stuff, and that was humans literally applying a patch, taking a screenshot, and posting it. So they could only do one every 2 or 3 minutes. With the AI, you can do hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. So,
And they
yeah,
just
it's
and they
definitely
also
useful.
this AI thing was brought up in the context of some issue queue etiquette and automated contribution credit gaming work, where you no longer get credit by default for anything. They took that away. It used to be pretty smart about uploading a patch, opening an MR, etc. Now you get nothing, and no one gets anything by default, and everything is up to the discretion of the maintainer. And we had to take it away because people abused it. But they abused it, as you said, with and without AI.
Yep, exactly.
Pivoting a bit, Nick, you mentioned during the pre-show something about state API, and I wanted to hear more about that.
Yeah, so I'm actually kind of proud about how this came about, and part of it was because of the show with that Matt Glomman was on and talked about how the new feature in Drupal 10.1, I think, that allows you to set up twig debugging
Yes.
in the browser or in the Drupal UI uses the state API. And of course, I was aware of the state API, but I never had actually used it myself. And I realized a lot of little things that I do for clients should use the state API. So for example, I'll sometimes store a value for when a process last ran and just store it in config. And I know that it gets overwritten on the next one, but it's, a lot of these things, like they need to run once a day, and if it runs twice a day or 3 times a day, because I do 2 deployments or something, it's not really the end of the world. State API is way better for that. But I had a request going on with a client where they had a bunch of little content that they wanted to tweak on the site. But because the way the site was integrated, it, normal things that you normally would just use a Drupal block for, it just wasn't going to work with the Drupal block. And I was trying to figure out how to handle that. So for example, some things in the footer, or some like social media icons and links, for example, that are just, they're used in many, many different places. And on a traditional site, you would just, you'd either make a content somewhere, or you would just have multiple blocks and have to remember everything that you need to update. Well, after that discussion with Matt about using the state API, I thought, well, hey, maybe we can use the state API for this. So
that's a terrible idea. I'm sorry. I had to jump in.
I'm curious to hear why.
Yeah, I mean, the state API, the state API should never be used for anything you want to have later that can't be auto regenerated. So you're the first example you mentioned about time, the last time cron was run is one thing it's used for, right? Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, if what if it goes away and then they have to retype in, like, you can't reference anything in there safely.
A lot of this is little content things, like what's the label for the newsletter sign up link, right? So there's defaults. So if it does go away, it just falls back to the default. They might have to tweak it again. I mean,
what's the advantage of using state over config in that case? Because this sounds like one thing that config actually would be good for.
The thinking was they want to, well, now I'm questioning my assumptions there. The thinking was they might want to, that would work with config too. Maybe it was just learned about a new tool and wanted to try it.
Yeah,
I mean, it's easier to convert.
When you have a new shiny hammer, everything's a nail.
yeah, no, I have to revisit that. I mean, it's simple enough to convert, because I mean, that's one of the cool things about the state API is it's pretty close. I mean, it's just a key value store.
And that's what I wanted to mention, which it literally is a single implementation of the key value service within Drupal core. A separate one, I don't know if you've ever heard of it or used it or talked about it, is Temp Store.
Oh yeah, I've used that.
Right, is a auto expiring key value implementation that's used for tracking the changes made in Views UI and Layout Builder, and those are the two main places they're used. So if you know in Views UI, you can go change a bunch of different things before hitting save. That's how that works. That's what it was built for, the Temp Store implementation. And it's just, as I said, the state and Temp Store are both implementations of the key value store.
There's also a private Temp Store, I think, too.
Private and shared Temp Store. Yeah, they have to do with whether or not the owner, someone else can access that or not. And that is useful for things like views, where multiple people might want to make or collaborate on configuration changes.
I've also used it on a form that has multiple steps that I don't really want to use kind of the built-in way of doing it. Like if you just need to store a value for a page refresh or something, that's
exactly what the thing I mentioned at the beginning of the show about the field UI, where we no longer try to save each step of the multi-step form until the very end. That's using Temp Store for the same reason.
Oh, nice, awesome.
Yep.
I have a dumb question, or maybe, yeah, I think it's a dumb question. Like, so if state API is just like the referencing like another piece of Drupal, like is state API adding some management for states in there? Is that why it's different?
Nope. It is, as far as I know, unless something has changed dramatically, it is all key value storage is you have a required column key, or collection rather, not column, a collection column in the database that says this is part of this collection. State
Right.
is the collection, and the rest is just regular straight key value. So it just removes an extra parameter, so you don't have to say when you're pulling up a key value store what collection it is. It's a convenience wrapper around the key value store.
I just remembered actually why, one of the main reasons why I went with State API. The client wanted to be able to change it whenever they wanted, and I didn't. We didn't have we didn't have the config. Like there's the config ignore. We don't have that module on the site, and I didn't want to configure that. But if you say that it is possible to just go away at some point, then I'll convert it.
It is not guaranteed to be there forever. It is intended for use with things that will be an inconvenience if they go away, but can be regenerated whenever you want.
That's the way I set it up. I mean, there's defaults. If it does go away, they can just re-edit. So it's like, that's the other thing to it. So
fair enough.
I'll look at it though. One more aside. What kind of situations make states go away? Like what?
Oh, I mean,
the only way it's how to clear it is like a manual. Like you have to call it a state delete.
Well, it depends. I mean, yes, I believe so, but I mean, I think there's also some best practices about just clearing out state when your database gets too big. Like, why not? It's supposed to be ephemeral data. You should be able to just wipe it.
Interesting. Okay.
And the other thing is, I don't think it's usually traditionally synced between environments. I mean, people are probably doing it because they want to. But yeah,
it's not. That was one of the features too, because then they could tweak it on a staging environment and see what it looks like, and not worry about it getting again. The reason why I went with state is because it feels a little bit more like content, in that it's per environment. They can tweak it whenever they want, and I won't overwrite it. But it sounds like the right way to do it is put in config and just set up the config and ignore rules. Which
in this case,
it's not a huge deal to overwrite. Or overwrite. It's not a huge deal to convert that. So
I'll just quickly add, Nick, for some of those use cases like you've talked about in terms of storing things like social media links, I've found that the config pages module can actually be really good for that in terms of making it easy to spin up a UI, and then you can access the values either through code or using tokens and those kinds of things.
We've used config pages quite a bit on the current project I'm working on, and it is really allowed for us to create kind of universal config pages for a Drupal multi-site that allows folks to go to those pages and set kind of site-specific configurations that they need. So
that's a cool one.
The interesting thing about the config pages is the structure of the config page is actually part of your site configuration, but the values stored within it are really content. So in that use case of wanting to like tweak things between environments, you can definitely do that even with config pages.
Yeah, that's why we're using it, is because we don't want a new site to have code changes in order to edit some of those things.
I wish I'd known about that last week. I would have used it.
I have so many more questions about the state API, but we could probably put those into a show at some point, I bet.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of other stuff that I'm going to be converting to the state API over time, but I'll look at the config pages and report back. So, Tim, I think you wanted to talk a little bit about, I know there's a new development process in Drupal. Typically, every 6 months or so, Drupal would just change what the head is pointed at. It's going to be the next minor version of Drupal, but with I think a lot of it has to do with the conversion finally to GitLab. There's been discussion about 11x being kind of the last switch, and then we're just going to be working from main as head in the future and just kind of tag things the way most projects do it. I'm curious a little. I remember reading some of the issues around it and realizing that there were some pretty gnarly things that made it a lot more difficult than you would normally think, especially with Drupal CI, I think. Sure. I'm curious what you think about that, since you're kind of a core maintainer. How has that transition gone?
Yeah, well, so you're absolutely right in describing it. I think the biggest, but what you said doesn't really capture the impact it has on core contributors. So when you file an issue, you pick a version that you're filing against,
Yep.
saying this bug is in this version of core. And so they had to go write a bot that moved the issue from one version to the other every, as you said, about 6 months. And sometimes now you go to an old issue and like the last 10 comments are just it getting moved every 6 months for 5 years, which can be very demoralizing. I think the second thing is that, now with the reason that we need it even more is that when you go to create an MR on an issue, if MR is sufficiently old enough, the new branches won't even exist in that issue fork. So when you do want to go move it to a new one, you have to know that you have to manually add the newest branches to the fork in order to change the target branch, and it's a mess for people. So for very many reasons, we wanted to make this change. And yeah, you're right. There's a lot of engineering toil that's going on the DA side to make this feasible. The first thing was getting it onto 11x, just so the release managers, so the Drupal core contributors could get used to the process of not having issues move every 6 months. And the rest is like, for example, they couldn't, in parts of Drupal CI, they couldn't have a branch name that didn't start with a number. Like it just rejected it. And so main was not available at that time. So they knew all these problems were going to happen. So they moved to 11x first so they could work out all the bugs. And they're working on them. I think they've made, I follow along loosely just to see the progress, but they've been making good progress. I think the biggest concern of mine in this intermediary state is that people are freaking out when issues get moved to 11x. And they're like, we just got on Drupal 10 and you're saying no one's going to care. We're not going to get this feature until 11x. And they're not reading between the fine print that says like, no, this is a placeholder. Like 10.2x doesn't exist as a branch. Nothing's getting into 10.2. It's getting committed to 11.
Maybe it should have been called 99 or something.
That would scare people even more. Maybe. I don't know. I mean, yeah, there were a lot of different ideas, and I don't think we realized this sort of psychological ramification of the move. And I've had to explain on many issues that like, no, it'll be in 10.2 because that's how it works, and like you don't need to worry. We're not putting it off for some future version. So I couldn't. The switch to actual main couldn't come any sooner, so that we can stop, having to allay people's concerns.
So is 10.2 the first release using 11x?
Yes, it will be the first release using 11x. Yes. So when it's time to tag 10.2, they will, tag it from the 11x branch.
How nervous are you about that change in the process? Because
zero concern, because I have a lot of faith in the release managers. Catch and Jess and Quiet One, who, first of all, have been doing this for a decade and also have scripts that they work with that they've tested and adapted to this and whatnot. So no, they're not going to have any trouble. And if we do, we won't. If they do, they won't tell anyone. We won't see them sweat. The release will happen just the same for everyone. Maybe they might be a little bit more stressed, but it won't impact anyone outside of them. They'll be fine.
So, if I'm hearing you correctly, after the 11x release, will it then switch to main?
Oh, it might switch to main. Ideal. I hope we don't take that long. At some point, we should be able to switch to main. Maybe during the 10.3 cycle, maybe during the 10.4 cycle, in the same way that we stopped doing 10.1, 10x, 10.2x, 10.3, and switched to using 11. I hope they're going to be able to migrate everything over to main well before G11. And then we will no longer have, new branches for new versions of Drupal. Like the branch will only exist after it's time to make the release.
Yeah, it just follows a more standard development workflow.
Yeah, it's exactly. We're just doing what everyone else does.
Yep.
And then you're relying on tags at that point for versions, right? Is that?
I mean, as far as I know, it's still standard. Maybe, I don't know. Actually, that's the wrinkle I don't know. Whether or not there will continue to be a 10.2x branch. That's a sort of. So you mentioned I'm a core maintainer. I'm not. I'm a subsystem maintainer of a specific couple subsystems within Drupal core. I am not a core committer. And so I'm not either privy nor responsible for any of these actual discussions. So I'm not exactly sure what the backport policy and how they're going to do branches and tags and all that stuff will actually work. All I know is as a core developer, core contributor, that things will just continue to get easier for me. I think the most recent tweak they had to make was dealing with composer aliases to point out that 10.2x and 11x and eventually main are all actually the same thing right now. And handling that, it was the most recent kind of wrinkle that they were dealing with to make sure that it's transparent to anyone using composer, so that no one else has to think about it.
Interesting.
I imagine this is all like due or a pleasant byproduct of the fact that like Drupal 8 was a rebuild, and now we're on this path of like just continually improving Drupal as opposed to like brand new versions and many breaking changes and all this other stuff. Kind of the work that's been done to improve the, I don't even know if it's called, I would call it the development process, but like the kind of like roadmap around Drupal.
Yeah, I would say that the Drupal 8 dev cycle almost killed me, and many other core contributors. It was brutal. It was extremely long and extremely painful and extremely demoralizing. And a lot of people didn't come out on the other side as core contributors. And it was something had to change. And the biggest, I would say, semantic versioning, semver, is like the biggest change that was made. But that led to, or allowed to happen, or part of that was the 6-month release cadence. Part of that was the strict backport policy and backwards compatibility, and when can we make changes, and pointing out that 10.1, 9.1, those were the biggest releases of Drupal. The 9.0, the 10.0, the 11.0 are the boring ones, because that's what semantic versioning means, and trying to shift the community's focus around that. All of those things came from the pain that was the Drupal 8 development cycle. But I would say that, semantic versioning became sort of the vehicle by which we brought all these these process improvements. Yeah. And that all of that stems from it. And so I don't think at GitLab either empowered us or motivated us or anything to make these changes. It's just that we didn't want to bother, and didn't want to bother porting all these Drupalisms to a new system when we could fully embrace semantic versioning and move to this kind of system.
I think another big part of it too is that GitHub happened and GitHub normalized the pull request workflow, and people started, and people came up with best practices around that. You got to remember, Drupal started before all that stuff. Drupal started before Git, right?
Yep.
And
CBS.
So, exactly. So it's, I think a lot of it is that people getting into it now really just, it used to be the patch system was like, oh, this is great. This is a breath of fresh air. It's so much easier than like a listserv or like a newsletter. Forum, like emailing stuff back and forth. But at this point, there's better ways to do it. But it's a mature project with millions and millions of issues. You can't just flip a switch and make that change. And it's, millions of sites depend on it. So it's a multi-year project to convert. So,
sure.
But I think one of the big drivers is people are just used to it, and it's a better workflow. So we need to get to there. It's just a 3-year process to change it.
For sure. And I think though that we have, because of the nature of our community and our contributor base, our process is even more sophisticated or superior to the standard patch PR MR workflow, where in every MR is actually an issue fork, and then anyone can get access and push to those. Because in typical development, other software projects, you have a single author comes in, does the MR, maybe get some feedback, and they fix it, and then it's merged in. But this, people will just drive by, drop off some contributions, and never come back ever again. And someone else needs to then pick that up and carry that. And our flow, and that was one of the biggest things I was advocating for, among many others. But when we were adopting that, was to continue to enable that sort of collaborative workflow, even in the MR thing. So ours is way more complicated than it needs to be.
Yeah.
But it is because we need it to be.
Yeah, and it allows you to like get access to it and make changes.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, Tim, you mentioned being a subsystem maintainer, and I think a lot of our listeners will naturally associate you with layout builders. So can you tell us, are there things that are being worked on right now in the layout builder ecosystem that you're excited about?
Yeah, I would say there's two main things that are sort of layout builder adjacent or direct contributions to it that I want to talk about. The first is the dashboards. So dashboard module, Drupal 7, not that great, not that useful. Some people liked it, but it's long gone now. But the new dashboard module that some of the people are working on, like Penasquito, is utilizing layout builder to allow users or roles or personas to customize the different aspects of their dashboard. And so this is the first time in core, at least, that layouts are going to be used for something other than, content. So sort of just a different way to do it. The nice thing is that I think they made a lot of great progress without needing any sort of major overhauls or changes to the layout system. So it kind of proved that the API works, which is very gratifying. But yeah, I'll make sure to link in the show notes to that. It's been some really cool and exciting stuff. Once again, just like the Field UI work, they started with, the user story and the persona and the research there, and then only picked up the code stuff later. The other thing is just, taking the layout builder that we do have that is used for content and sort of improving that editorial flow and the both for content authors as well as for site builders. One specific example is with site builders. If you go down the route of inline custom blocks, the native core version of kind of paragraphs, just like paragraphs, you can run into some nasty performance and scaling issues when you have thousands and thousands of blocks. And so there's some proposals to kind of tweak the way that those are created and generated, and only sort of make them more available on demand or upon request, I guess, and not just create all the possibilities for you up front, as well as allowing you to kind of pre-create blocks that then editors can use, that will both help, as I said, with the user experience, but also with the performance. I think the other thing is sort of there's an ongoing open-ended discussion about the future of the improvements to the editorial side between, we have Cicada 5 and it's fantastic, and we have Layout Builder and it does its thing, and there's sort of a gap between them, and then there's Gutenberg, which kind of does a little bit of both. And so there's a lot of discussions in the community right now, especially coming out of the Pittsburgh kind of elevation of Gutenberg, to kind of see how we can have those things coexist and improve each other and work together. So as I said, I'll make sure the links are in the show notes, but there's a lot of energy and excitement around this work, which has been great.
Well, thank you guys for joining us, and thank you, Martin, for joining last minute. We appreciate that.
Do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on the social network formerly known as Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more by going to talkingdrupal.com/TD promo.
Get the Talking Drupal newsletter to learn more about our guest hosts, show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, and much more. Sign up for the Drupal newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. And if you're a listener and you're wondering what kinds of things you get as a patron, you get the before and after show. And if you are a patron for this week's episode, you will get an extra long show where we planned today's episode due to a last-minute scheduling conflict. So you get about 45 minutes, and if there's any time after, you get to hear anything that we chat about with the guest hosts and guests after the show. So if you want to become a patron, you can go to talkingdrupal.com and choose the Become a Patron button. Well, we've reached the end of the show. So if our listeners wanted to get in touch with you, Martin, what's the best way to do that?
On various social and Drupal platforms, they can find me as Manclue, and they can read some of my blog posts on manclue.com or dev.acquia.com.
And Tim, how about you?
Tim Plunkett on most socials.
With a period.
With a period sometimes, yeah.
And I have to mention, I was giving credit to you and Tim Doyle for the Drupal Association episode, and both of the Tims have periods in their name as well, which broke the credit form. I had to refresh it and do it again, but
you're welcome.
John, how about you? How can our listeners get in touch with you?
You can find me on most of the social networks at John Picozzi, no period. And you could find out about EPAM at epam.com.
And you can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. Have a good one, everyone.